So as I say, we are going to be recording the session, so make it more accessible for those people that aren't able to come at this specific time. If I can ask everybody to keep themselves on mute so that we don't interrupt. Sometimes we get feedback as well, so that we're not interrupting our specialists as well. I would like to point out that the excavations that we're undertaking are still ongoing. So the session we're having today, the speaker talks we're having today, are about what we know so far, but obviously it's not the entirety of what we're hoping to find out. It's just the latest update of what we've got. This also means that some of the interpretations we have are very at the basic level. We've not had the time yet to go into them in much more depth. That will be happening later on. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. That's going to be Simon. Simon is the project manager for the excavation for the sites. So he's going to be talking to us about what we're learning from the sites. Simon, over to you.
Is that on? You see that?
Yep, perfect. Good to go.
Thank you very much. So, as said, I'm Simon. I'm the project manager from Museum of London Archaeology, looking after for the A428 Black Cat Caxton Gibbet Improvements. We started work on the scheme in July 2022, not including our sort of preliminary works, the geophysics and trial trenching that we've done back in 2020. Up to the end of February 2023, we've done over 40,000 hours of work on the scheme. And that includes our field teams, so our archaeologists, supervisors, surveyors who are in the field currently, as well as our outer field teams, so our processors, specialists, admin, logistics, and management. We've stripped over 160,000 square meters of land, which is around a quarter of the anticipated size of the scheme. The 4,700 contexts, which are our individual records for the archaeology that we're uncovering. From that archaeology, we've recovered over 360 soil samples, 1,500 bags of pottery and animal bone, and over 800 metal objects such as nails, brooches, and pieces of worked flint. Our work has consisted of a range of field activities, including using large machines to strip away the topsoil and subsoil to reveal the archaeology. We've excavated various features on site by hand, and we're understanding the way landscapes were used thousands of years ago and recovering anything that may have been left behind by the previous occupants. We've also been surveying our sites to accurately map the archaeology, and we've been engaging with the local councils and national highways over the findings. We've also been producing loads of social media posts, blogs, and our podcast Highways to the Past to keep local communities engaged in our work, and working with local schools to teach children about the archaeology of their area. As well as hand excavating the features that have been hidden for thousands of years, our geoarchaeologists have been drilling deeper into the environment those people lived in. Taking cores like this one is allowing us to look at how the past landscapes changed as previous inhabitants interacted with them. We can tell where areas were cleared of trees and crops planted. And for example, one of our Roman sites has revealed evidence of grape pollen, meaning that vines were cultivated along parts of the route in around the 1st or 2nd centuries AD. The majority of the archaeology we've investigated so far on the scheme has been Iron Age or Roman. However, we do have some residual Neolithic and Bronze Age finds, which point to landscapes being used before formalised settlements were established. This is when hunter-gatherers were using the landscape for migratory pathways, likely using topographic landmarks to guide themselves through the landscape, for example, watercourses like the River Great Ouse, which the scheme crosses. Here we have some examples of some decorated Neolithic pottery on the right, and a flint tool called an adze, which is similar to a small axe. Both of these finds came from later features, but show us that people were here before the formal settlements were established. Settlements were established across the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire regions, predominantly in the Iron Age. They started as unenclosed small groups of round houses and developed eventually into larger, more defined settlements with ditches and banks and defined plots of land, large areas of enclosed field systems, and industrial activity associated with day-to-day life. One of our smaller excavation areas on top of a prominent ridge revealed over 50 post holes, seen here in yellow. From these, our teams identified patterns to discern where buildings may have been. And on this example, we've got two subcircular structures, probably roundhouses, as well as a possible rectangular structure. Because none of the post holes were cutting each other, we have to rely on our specialists to help us determine which buildings came first, a process which is still ongoing. From one of the post holes, though, our teams have recovered this tiny pot, seen here with a 5 centimetre scale. So each one of those small blocks underneath the block on the right are 1 centimetre each. The pot itself is only 1.7 centimetres tall and 2.6 centimetres wide and weighs only 10 grams. We're not currently sure exactly what this is used for, but theories include it was a small crucible for something non-metallic, or more likely, a children's toy, which I prefer. Work is still ongoing in unlocking this object story. In the Middle to Late Iron Age, so from around 300 BC onwards, more formalised enclosures replaced the isolated structures. Here we can see a substantial D-shaped enclosure in the centre of the field, shown in blue, with several internal plots in green, each likely with its own use, somebody's house or garden, animal paddocks, processing areas, etc. They may look a bit odd, but they actually make up several phases of reorganisation of the space over the course of hundreds of years. Additional enclosures, seen in red or possibly orange, depending on how it looks on the screens, were created to expand the settlement space, as well as with further storage spaces, work areas, and buildings added in the late Iron Age. Field systems and a trackway in yellow radiate off the main settlement, demarcating plots of farmlands, different crops or animal pastures, and linking up to further sites in the periphery of the scheme, but not included within the development area.
Hi, Simon. Sorry, we're having a few sound issues. Are you able to speak a bit slower for us? Just so it's a bit clearer. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. So we've been recovering ironworking residues, seen here on the left of this slide, known as slag, and dumps of butchered animal bone on the right, which help us see how communities operated during these periods. And we're going to hear a bit more about animal bone towards the end of this session. Pottery helps us give dates to all this activity, especially when it comes from the bottom of large features. These can help us identify when these enclosures were originally created. Here we have an example of some of the Iron Age pottery that we've been finding. Many of the Iron Age settlements continued in use into the Roman period, but they saw extensive reorganisation. Here we have an example of an Iron Age settlement shown in yellow, which consists of a large subcircular enclosure with additional smaller enclosures on the outside, several roundhouses in the centre, but no internal divides. In the Roman period, this is completely reorganised and replaced by a large rectangular enclosure towards the centre of the field and a full formalised trackway to the north, as well as smaller enclosures for various different activities. In the Iron Age, most of the activity on site appears to be domestic, with really dark organic fills seen within the features, such as the example in the top right. However, in the Roman period, most of the fills of the features are very sterile, not a lot of charcoal, very little organic material being recovered, which points to a different use within this landscape. In the Roman period, they probably aren't living on this site, but they would have been living nearby. We've also seen evidence of quarrying for the Roman period, extracting chalk and gravels from outcrops to be used for trackways and possibly within buildings. The Roman settlements have been particularly productive when it comes to finds, with a large array of animal bone and pottery. Some of the pottery is even stamped, like the example shown in the centre, which will hopefully allow us to match those finds up with specific potters and workshops. An array of metal finds from the site has included hobnails from shoes, styluses, and belt mounts. Some of these objects may have a military connection, belonging to soldiers travelling through here during the Roman period, or possibly having been stationed nearby. The Iron Age and Roman settlements are abundant in the region, spaced sometimes less than 500 metres apart, showing the intensity in which the area was farmed since around 300 BC onwards. Our work on the scheme is ongoing, with fieldwork continuing into 2024, programmed alongside the construction works, and post-excavation work following on from that. It will take some time for us to fully unlock the stories that still hide in this landscape, but we will be keeping the local communities informed of what we uncover.
Thank you, Simon. I do apologise for the sound quality. I think that's a bit of a technical issue. So we are, yeah, I'm sorry about that. But hopefully the captions helped work for you. And yeah, Simon's not allowed to go anywhere, so he can be answering some of your questions later. So without any more waffle from me, we're going to go to Sanda. Now, Sanda is our A428 post-excavation manager. So she's going to talk to us a little about what that actually involves, what the work they're currently doing. Sanda.
Hi all, just 1 second for me to share my screen with you. Okay, and then can you all see it?
Perfect, thank you.
Perfect. So, hello everyone. Today I will walk you through the post-excavation work we do as a part of this large project. And I'm hoping to show you some interesting bits and pieces we found so far. As Kat mentioned, since our work is still ongoing and our specialists are still looking at these finds, some of this information might slightly change, or we might get some more detail later on. So, as Simon mentioned, A428 project covers a lot of ground area and is divided into multiple sites. And basically our field teams have been working on these sites with the different starting dates, which means that our post-excavation work and the field work are running parallel to each other. As this is quite a large amount of work and we are generating a lot of material, currently we have teams in Crofton Oaks, Stansted, Chester and London going through all of this material. And we are also planning the setup of another facility that will be dedicated just to A428 post-ex work. The work we do includes environmental processing, finds processing, conservation, specialist assessments, reporting, and ultimately archiving of these finds. Processing work in itself begins once we receive the finds and samples from site. In the first instance, our team logs all the material. They note the weight of the unclean finds. They see what we have. They separate them on their different materials. And then basically they start with washing or dry cleaning of finds depending on the material. For example, pottery shards will be washed, but metal will be just gently brushed. Our environmental samples go through a slightly different process that we call wet sieving and flotation. And you can see one of our flotation tanks here on the photos. This means that basically we use water to push the soil samples through these tanks, and the residues are caught with these sieves that you can see here. That way, basically, we capture all the tiny fragments of pottery, bone, charcoal, shell, and seeds that help us interpret the past environments. Both finds and residues from samples, after they are cleaned, they get dried in a specialized room that we call a drying room, and you can see a portion of it here. So this room is basically held at the stable temperature and humidity to facilitate the quick drying of the material. After the material is clean and dry, our finds get quantified, which means we weigh how much we have of each type, and basically we log them into our system. We mark them, and you can see this process here on the photos. And we prepare them to go to our specialists for the assessments. Previously mentioned residues from samples, they also get sorted, and we basically pull out the material that we found in them, and we join them with the rest of the finds to go to the specialists. So far, the majority of finds we've processed from A428 are pottery and animal bone. Our specialist, Chris, will tell you more about the animal bone later. Most pottery we processed and assessed dates from Iron Age and Roman period. The majority of the early and middle Iron Age pottery shards, they belong to jars that were used for cooking and for storage. They were made within the household using mostly locally available sandy shell fabrics. The later Iron Age pottery we found shows this transition from homemade vessels that were fired at low temperatures to the ones that were finished on a slow wheel. So we have this kind of like a progression in pottery production that we are seeing. We still mostly have jars used for cooking at this point. With Roman age pottery, it shows more variation in shape and usage. Common types we found include bowls, jars, beakers, dishes, and mortaria. They were not used just for cooking, but also for storage and dining and other household usages. Most of the Roman age pottery we found was produced locally in the production centers at Haddam, Oxford, and Lower Nain Valley. But we have also found some shards of amphora and Samian pottery, which is this very shiny, bright yellow that red, sorry, that you can see here. And these ones were basically imported from other regions of Roman Empire. And this variety in pottery types that we see coming from sites, we basically use them to interpret the everyday life and development of pottery production in the region. And it also tells us about kind of economy and trade, because the presence of the imported vessels tell us that this region was not isolated, but that they had established wide trading routes. One of the interesting things we found so far, and Simon also briefly mentioned in his lecture, is two tiny pots. So this is one of them, and this is the other. One of them was discovered by our team while processing samples from site. And I can say that that's kind of like the interesting bit of the post-ex work for me, because this question gets asked a lot, because you not only get to be the first one to see these finds all cleaned up, but if you are lucky, you might even find some new finds that were previously overlooked due to the amount of mud that is on site. After we found this little pot, we compared it with the material we found on the other sites, and we realized we had another one that was very similar. That's more white in color. Our specialists dated them to the Iron Age period, and they tell us that they were made by basically taking a small bowl of clay and
This is the A40.
and somebody pressing their finger in to get this shape. And due to the simplicity of how they were made, it's believed that basically anyone could have made them. And they could have been used as a, let's say, toy for a child. They could have been used as a thimble, or the whiter one of the two, it was suggested that it might have been a crucible, which is basically a very small pot used to melt metal inside. We are hoping that the further assessments by our specialists will give us some more information about these tiny pots. Besides the pottery and bones, we have also had some interesting finds made of other materials. Across our sites, we have found multiple Roman copper alloy coins dating from mid-2nd century to 4th century AD. Most of them are from 3rd and 4th century. The coins you see here date in the early 4th century. The left one shows the head of Emperor Constantius II with a camp gate shown on the back of the coin. We think it was minted in Arles Mint between 325 and 326 AD. The second one you can see on the right shows the head and the inscription of the Emperor Licinius II. On the back, you can see kind of a victory theme, so a trophy with 2 captives underneath it. And this coin was probably minted in Trier Mint around 320 AD. We are hoping once our specialist gets a chance to look at these coins in more detail that we might get a more backstory to them. These types of well-preserved coins are basically always a welcome find on our site, as they not only help with dating of the site itself, but can also provide evidence of the economy of the region, of the trade and import routes, and of basically the politics of the period. Among other finds, we have also found some flint blades and flakes, mostly Neolithic to early Bronze Age in date. We have several locally made loom weights made from fire clay, dating from Iron Age to Roman period. These weights were used in textile production, and they're quite interesting for us, considering that wooden looms and textiles usually don't survive. So by finding these weights, we can deduct that there was a certain textile production in the area. One such example of the loom weight you can see here on the photo. We have also found 2 Roman age styluses. These little needle-like objects were used to write text on the wax tablets. They were usually made with one side being sharp, so you could basically inscribe the writing into the wax. And the other side, that on this particular example has been broken off, would usually be either flat or round, so you could use it as a sort of eraser to erase the inscription from the wax in case you made some mistake. We also found few copper bow-shaped brooches dating from Iron Age to Roman period. One of the examples you can see here on the photo. They were usually used to fasten clothing. We also found some jewelry, such as this ring that you see here. And basically all of these finds, they, as I mentioned before, help us to create this complete picture of life in this area throughout history. And we are hoping as the fieldwork progresses and we get to process and analyze more of these finds, that we will have more interesting stories to share with you. And that would be all from me.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful stuff. Yes. So onwards then to Chris. Chris is one of our zooarchaeologists, so focusing on the animal bone remains, and he's going to talk to us about what his job involves and what he's up to at the minute, and so far what they've found. Over to you, Chris.
Right, firstly, let's see if my screen will actually work.
Looking good? Yeah.
Oh, good, thank God for that. Right, let's get rid of this. Cool, thank you. Afternoon, well, morning, everybody, afternoon. As Kat said, I'm Chris. I'm one of the zooarchaeologists on the A428, and I'm going to talk to you about by weight, the second most numerous find site we find on an archaeological site, which is animal bone. This is kind of a trailer for Zooarch on the A428. One of the first things we do when we come off site is essentially an assessment, which is now we know what we found, what are we going to do with it? At this stage, it's more of a broad kind of skim of the assemblage. We don't ID animals entirely to species if they're a bit complicated. We don't do some of the measurements. So unfortunately, everything I'm kind of talking about now is going to be broad, but still, we can still make some nice conclusions about animal farming in the area. The scheme itself, the black cat in the bottom left and Campbell on the right. We're very, very lucky that our portion of the A428 is the end of a very, very long-running archaeological scheme of works running from the entire of Milton Keynes to Cambridge. And there's a great deal of archaeological work being done and has been done in the Claylands to the west of Cambridge. Some very, very large sites, which means very, very large animal bone assemblages. So one of the things that's really useful for us in this portion is that we've got lots and lots of nice things to compare our sites to. No site is an island, especially in this landscape. Always have to compare. The first thing you do is compare it with other sites. So what I thought to basically do to start with it is look at some of these comparative sites, primarily on the eastern and western ends of the scheme. Have a quick look at the existing information, and then look at some of the most important sites that we've already excavated, which are predominantly at the western end of the scheme, and see how we can kind of integrate the two. Let's go. Let's start with the western end. If people viewing live here, I apologise for telling you where you live. One of the biggest sites we can compare our material from the A428 is Love's Farm and Winchcombe Park in St Neots. Love's Farm is the rectangular bit of housing to the right of the railway line, and Winchcombe is the massive building site underneath it. One of the important things about this site is it does have an impact on our work, because as you can see, the A428 clips the bottom end of Winchcombe Park. It's a massively intensively excavated area, started in 2004 and is still ongoing. Around 1.5 tons of animal bones so far from both ends, which is, aside from certain A14 sites, the largest animal bone assemblage from the region. Largely Iron Age Roman with a very scattering of Saxon. Sheep are the main species farmed in both areas, with slightly smaller numbers of cows and few pigs. This is a distribution we commonly see into the Iron Age and Roman period, where you get slightly larger sheep. Sheep are the most predominant species. The numbers increase, and then into the Roman period, slightly different things happen depending on how Romanized, inverted commas, the site is. If the military involved, you tend to see a slightly larger number of pigs. In the Roman, cattle increase as well. But there's a lot of intra-site variation on sites in this period. So these are very, very broad kind of conclusions. Animals were bred on site. There's little evidence of specialization or surplus. Animals were bred for milk, wool, pulling plows, mounts, etc. There was no particular specialization. They weren't particularly concentrating on wool production. They weren't concentrating on dairy. It was subsistence farming, essentially. Lots of sites, and I'm assuming lots of sites on our section of the 428 will show this. On the Western Claylands, farming practices largely continue unchanged into the Roman period. If the Romans don't park up next door and you're in a small village, there's no reason for you to stop farming the animals you're farming. So if anyone's done any background reading, local society members about the archaeology of the Claylands, the word continuity turns up quite a lot in book titles. And this is what we're kind of looking to find on the A428. Interesting deposits. We have a lot of late Roman antler working, and we have some Roman sausage dogs. When archaeologists ask us, when we find a dog, what breed is it? Zooarchaeologists can be quite reticent because breed is very much a modern term, but that's not to say that in the past there weren't large dogs, small dogs, fat dogs, thin dogs. The Romans especially had a very wide body type distribution. You had some large guard dogs, mastiff sized things, greyhound type hunting dogs, and they did indeed have lap dogs. Two main types, kind of chihuahua size looking things, and then sausage dog, which we will come to later. The other end of the site, which is going to be a very nice comparative, is obviously Camborne. In terms of the A428 at the other end of our scheme, there's very little actual animal bone evidence from the road corridor. Site one, which you can see just by the gibbet, hardly had any bone. So the main comparative we're going to look at is going to be Camborne, obviously the new town, not that new anymore. But it's different because it's not a very intensive area. It's basically a conglomeration of individual settlements. Again, slightly different to Love's Farm. Cattle and sheep are present in roughly equal numbers in the Iron Age, but then we get this kind of thing we see a lot in Iron Roman sites when the importance of cattle increases. Again, there's few pigs in either period, which is a point we'll come to later. There's very little evidence of breeding in the Iron Age of Camborne. Cattle and sheep are largely for meat and pulling ploughs. Slightly more evidence of breeding seen into the Roman period. Also, on the Claylands, this is the first site that cat is seen in the Roman period. So again, we've got this very, very nice landscape of comparisons. We've got a lot of stuff. When we finish analysing all our sites at the end of the day, there's a lot of stuff to talk about, and we can put it into the picture of the entire settlement in the area. Our sites, onto the good stuff. The majority of the sites that have undergone post-excavation assessment is at the western end, which is obviously, you see the black cat. From these sites, we have about 260 kilos of bone, dating from the early Iron Age to largely the Roman with a very small amount of Saxon, with the largest amounts recovered from the middle Iron Age and late Roman phases. Here, slightly different to sites in the north, cattle more numerous in the Iron Age, with sheep numbers increasing into the later Iron Age, but still cattle is the dominant species here, which, as I said, is slightly different to some of the other sites. We believe the consensus is at this point is this is largely due to the water table. Anyone who's dug here, which includes me, and anyone who's lived in the area, which I have, will know how soggy it gets. You can probably throw a bucket from one of our western sites and hit the ooze. About half a mile to the south, the ooze and the Ivor broad almost touch at 10 foot. So it's a very, very waterlogged area. Sheep do not like being wet. They do not like it. They don't like eating wet fodder. It makes them excessively prone to parasites like liver flukes. So the majority of Roman and Iron Age sites we get with lots and lots of sheep tend to be in the south of England. It's nice, well-drained, chalky, sandy soil. There's been some studies that show that kind of species proportions in the Iron Age aren't directly linked to geology itself, but the water table is definitely a thing. We've done, on another project on the A14, we've done isotopic analysis to show that as opposed to cattle, the sheep on some of the A14 sites were grazed on a much wider area than the cows, which intimates that the sheep, not liking the floodplain, are being grazed further up onto the what we'd call hills for Cambridgeshire. But pigs are again scarce. In the Iron Age and early Roman periods, you don't get a lot of pigs in this area particularly. Pigs like what we call pannage, which is kind of scattered woodlands, tree cover, somewhere to like root. They don't like being kept on open land. So as I said, unless the military liked pigs, breed fast, eat anything, produce lots of meat. So if there's a military site nearby, it tends to kind of up. They like the pigs, essentially. But on the majority of rural sites, not a great deal of pig. On some of our western sites, dogs and cats are present, including a number of intact burials. I've used the ritual word. We don't like to use it, but in this case, some of them have quite clearly been treated in a special manner. There was clearly a place for dogs in Iron Age religion, and that definitely carried over into some aspects of the Roman period. There are some burials here. There's a dog burial from one of our western sites that's in a pit with a 6-month-old pig and some chicken on its own, which is quite interesting because domestic fowl had a ritual connotation in the Iron Age as well. So at full analysis, this is definitely things we're going to be looking at. There's some very interesting dog burials further up the site at Love's Farm, which I mentioned earlier. There was a intact dog that's had its eyes replaced with stones for whatever reason. Wild animals on the site, relatively limited. Exploitation of wild resources in the Iron Age and Roman period. They did hunt wild animals, but it didn't form a large part of the diet. The majority of wild animal remains, such as deer, are largely resulting from antler working. However, we do have them on our site. We have postcranial bones, lower limb elements, which proves that they were eating them to a certain extent. We've got red and roe deer, rabbit. There's a possible fox on site. Postcranial fox remains in dog are quite difficult to identify. You need to do some metrical wizardry, which, as I said, we're only at post-assessment stage at the moment. It's not something that we're going to do. It's interesting that the possible fox remains are feet, which would have been left attached to skins, and there have been some foxes found on other sites in the area that we believe weren't foxes that have come in as pelts. So again, this is something nice we're going to look at. Domestic fowl is scarce. There's only one context from our western sites that has chicken in it. Other bird species, we have corvids such as crows, jackdaws, etc. Ubiquitous songbirds, we've got some waders, and also a possible seabird fragment. But again, at assessment stage, we're not going into too much detail. We know it is there, and we can tell the archaeologists writing up the site that there's the potential for them. Environmental samples can always give us fish, frogs, and mammals, and we definitely have this here. We have eel, we have frogs, and lots of small mammals. Not a lot of fish. It's beyond the scope of this talk, and many people have written many things, but we never appear to find a great deal of fish in Iron Age and Roman sites, even in the fens, where it's inconceivable that they're not exploiting freshwater resources. But again, this is one of these things that's kind of beyond the scope of this talk. Just in case people don't know, it doesn't all come out looking lovely and in one piece. These are 2 photos of some stuff I was looking at in the western sites. This is actually the dog and the pig burial I was talking about earlier, just to show you what it looks like, really. In terms of the sites, they were breeding all domestic animals. We have evidence of fetal and neonatal sheep, pigs, cattle, not a great deal of horse. There's evidence further north at Love's Farm and other sites at Hinchinbrook that there was some specialised horse ranching was going on in the Iron Age, specific breeding site for horses, but we don't have that here. There's very, very good potential. Like I said, it's 260 kilos, which is a medium to large size assemblage. There's lots of potential to compare, especially in the Middle Iron Age and late Roman periods. I said earlier that we don't go into too much detail, but when something springs out on the lab bench, there's a few little tricks we can do to kind of give the archaeologist a heads up at what's going on. And one of the things is we've seen evidence of draft cattle on certain sites. You can largely tell in the form of this pathology on the lower limb bones. And there's also the presence of steers, castrated animals. There's a couple of little tricks you can look at the shape of the horn cores on cattle. You can do a quick measurement of some of the lower limb elements to give you a broad idea of whether you're looking at male, female, or castrated animals. Steers were largely used for ploughing. You get all of the muscle and none of the violence. There've been ethnographic studies, and very, very few people in history have ploughed with oxen. It's just not worth your life. One of the other interesting things we have a very large amount of antler working waste in the Middle Iron Age at our western sites, which is not something that we found very often. So again, it's these little things we can kind of, it's essentially we're skimming the surface of the animal bone at the moment, but there's still stuff we can give to the archaeologist before full analysis starts. So where do we go from here? Like I said, the formal assessment for each of these sites, we'll do each site in turn, and it'll outline the potential for the full analysis. This can be based on the sample itself, its wider context. Like I said, no site is an island, especially on the Western Cambridgeshire Claylands. It's pointless analysing a site on its own merits. These are not isolated settlements. And obviously we'll look at the Assembly's general contribution to the project, and our western sites are looking to be one of the most important areas that we'll be looking at in terms of its own size and the fact that it's quite near to a lot of these really nice, interesting comparative sites. Analysis stage involves full recording of the material. So as I said, any species that will require proper ID at this stage, so the seagull, foxes, etc., will be examined, and we'll do the full suite, as much information as we can get. So we'll measure the bones, age them, sex them, any pathology work virtually noted and fully recorded. And this is the end stage. So this is, but we not, essentially what I'm doing now is just showing we have the potential to do this. Also in conjunction with other specialisms, we can make recommendations for other scientific techniques, such as isotopic analysis, which can look at where the animals are coming from geographically, what they're eating. And we always do this in conjunction with other specialisms, such as the pottery specialists, the archaeobotanists, and in particular, the human bone specialists. Obviously, if you're looking at what people are eating, the animal bone and the human bone are extremely important. So what we tend to do is wait, and then I will talk to the human bone specialist, and then we'll decide when it comes to looking at the isotopic analysis of diet, we can start looking at kind of meshing this thing. No site is an island, no specialism is an island, essentially. But I think that is, I believe, a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, it's all really informative. So we do have a few questions in the chat, although I know Simon has been answering some of those. Thank you very much, Simon. So we can start with those. But if everybody does have a question, you should be able to raise your hand. It should be in the reactions button at the bottom if you've got any questions, and then I can come to you and you can ask those. But I think from one of the ones that is in the chat, let's have a look. I think one of them was, yeah, so for you, Simon, in what area are the Iron Age post holes that you showed in one of your slides, or are we finding them more widely?
So we are getting sort of Iron Age post-built structures across the scheme, but the ones I showed within the side are sort of relatively close to the River Great Ouse. We don't use specific site references within our outreach, mainly to protect the archaeology. What we don't want is to identify exact locations while we're still working, because it opens up the potential for people like Nighthawks to access the sites and sort of know where to look effectively. So we don't give specific details at this stage. But we are getting Iron Age post-built structures, roundhouses, that kind of thing across most of our Iron Age settlement sites.
Great, thank you. And perhaps a wider question, I don't know if any of you would know yet, but is there any plans or thoughts yet of where the material will be deposited in the future once it's all ready for archive, essentially, I suppose? No? One for find out then. We can find that one out.
So far, it should go for Cambridgeshire and Bedfordshire museums, so it should stay basically locally.
Yeah, and I know from speaking to other units that even if it is archived there or deposited there, then it will be accessible for other institutions for loan as well. So that's hopefully, yeah, so local people should be able to see it. Oh, one from Liz, probably for you, Chris. Where was the horse breeding area?
The horse breeding area was further up the A1. Well, essentially it's an Iron Age site that is at Hinchingbrook, Bogswood, which is now Hinchingbrook Hospital. So there isn't a great deal to see. It was dug in, 2003 by Oxford Archaeology, but essentially it's a very nice comparative site for us. But essentially what they had a lot of young neonatal horses in a greater proportion than we'd expect if you were just using your horses for general recreation, general tasks. We find these occasionally, and they're normally a site that is a specific breeding area. But like I said, it is currently Yeah, it's under Hinchinbrook Hospital at the moment. It was dug very long ago by Oxford Archaeology, and I believe unfortunately the current site is stuck in development publishing hell and has been for quite a while. But so unfortunately, there isn't a great deal of information for people to look at. But yes, it's at Hinchinbrook.
Possibly one for you, Simon. Have we come across any evidence for the Iron Age Roman flooding of the Black Cat settlement sites?
No, so we've seen the evidence from the Black Cat quarry and the flooding events that we're seeing within those settlement sites, but the work that we've been doing nearby hasn't had similar deposit sequences. We're on slightly higher ground than the sites that were excavated during the Black Cat quarry works, so we're not seeing the same level of flooding events. However, we can see that it was still particularly wet. We have various sort of paleo channels across some of our sites, so old water courses. And we are seeing evidence of sort of shifting of settlements up onto higher ground through the Iron Age and into the Roman period. But we certainly don't have the same sort of level of flooding as we've seen in sort of previous excavations associated with the quarries.
Fantastic. Sander, one for you, because you get to see them when they're cleaned up and you're finding finds that aren't seen on site due to the levels of mud and perhaps the tininess of them. So what is your favourite find so far and why?
So far, well, I really like Tiny Pot, which you might have guessed because I talked a lot about it. I love those kind of like surprising finds that you don't expect, and then you find something so out of character and you're just trying to figure out what it was, how did they use it, and it's pretty much what this particular Tiny Pot is. We are quite excited to keep digging and see if maybe we find some more.
Brilliant, wonderful. And actually on surprising finds, both Chris and Simon, is there anything that's particularly surprised you so far? So maybe Simon first, anything that surprised you that we found?
I mean, to not sort of repeat the same answer all the time, I think that Tiny Pot is probably the most surprising find that we've had. But it is interesting that we're getting this sort of potential military connection in the Roman period to one of our sites. The fact that we may have had either soldiers stationed there or nearby is quite an interesting thing to uncover. We don't see a lot of that within sort of standard settlements, so that's been quite unusual.
And Chris, anything surprised you, or has it all been pretty as expected so far?
In terms of what we're finding species-wise, it is as expected. Like, there's not a lot of species diversity in kind of rural sites, especially when we're talking kind of like small self-contained farmsteads. You know, it's highly likely you're going to get turtle or mongoose flying in, especially into the Iron Age period. Yeah, it's a slight problem with Zooarch is that the recording itself can get a bit tedious, but it's far more the information you get at the end. It's the conclusions where everything kind of comes to life. So I always feel a bit bad when people ask me this question, because urban sites, yes. Rural sites, it tends to be, the recording tends to be the legwork, and then the nice stuff comes when we're actually doing the number crunching at the end. So unfortunately, no.
But maybe still potential. Brilliant.
Yes.
Question from David: are there tiny pots known from elsewhere?
So our specialist did a bit of digging, and she did found the information that there was one similar tiny pot found in Cambridgeshire, also Iron Age. However, this one was a bit different because it was a bit bigger than the one we have, and it also had a handle. So similar, but how to say, not identical, which is often the case with the finds.
Brilliant. There is a question from Jessica, but because it's related, I'm going to go to John's. So he says, could the tiny pots be experimental pieces where the potters were testing the available clay for quality and usability, do we think?
Well, it is possible, because since it's so kind of amateurishly made, it could have been. So that's why, like, our specialist did say, like, it could have been made by anyone, a child could have made it impersonating a parent that was creating the clay, or as John said, like, yes, they could have been just like trying out the clay itself.
Fantastic. So back to Jessica's, and probably one for you, Simon. Have you captured any evidence for how they're fencing the Iron Age and Roman enclosures?
We're seeing some evidence for banks associated with sort of the main boundary ditches. So sort of the material they're digging out of these ditches being sort of stacked up next to them effectively. And some of those may have had hedge lines or something running along the side of them. We had on one of our sites, we've actually had a Roman positive earthwork surviving underneath a medieval headland. So we've actually had the mound surviving, which wouldn't normally be the case. Usually they're ploughed away. We're not seeing evidence of sort of formalized fence lines. We're not seeing post holes or anything like that are sort of surviving of fences alongside these locations. But we do have sort of within internal spaces of settlements some sort of smaller fence lines marking off plots, as well as the ditches that we saw on the plan that I showed.
Brilliant, brilliant. And then from Richard, have we on any of our sites, is there any evidence for the Roman road, the route from Sandy to Godmanchester?
Not yet, because we haven't excavated that part of the route yet. But it is coming within our future excavations.
Fantastic, fantastic. So lots of the things we're finding are sort of Iron Age Roman, which I expected. So, but have we have any evidence, or do we know what's happening after the Roman period?
So most of the sites that we've done so far, there's been no evidence of continued occupation after around the 2nd century. Most sites seem to be abandoned by that point. We are picking up some residual sort of 5th century, 6th century activity, but not in the way of buildings and enclosures, just sort of sporadic find points, bits of pottery and sort of metalworking that date to later periods. Having said that, there are some sites on the scheme which had evidence within evaluation that there will be some 5th, 6th, 7th century occupation. We just haven't got to those yet.
Cool. It's all future coming. And then ultimately, how will the results be published from the scheme with all the findings?
Well, so far we are going to have basically our reports done after the project is completed, and depending on the findings and stuff, we will then discuss basically more about a more in-depth publications of results. But basically it's still early days and we are still just going through the material and connecting the dots, so stay tuned.
Fantastic. Thank you all. So I think we've got last few minutes if there's any more questions in the room. Or say in the room, it's very strange. Oh yeah, so from the floor. But if there's not, I'd just like to thank you for your time, the lovely speakers, for sparing your time, but also thank you to everybody who is here for coming along and showing some interest and kind of sending in some brilliant questions as well. So thank you for coming as well. And it's hopefully that you've learned something, and or at least sort of feel a bit more informed. And of course, I suppose if you can always follow along on our channels, so on our our Facebook, our social media, and I know there's some sort of our webpage as well. It's got some more information. So hopefully we'll show some more information up on there as it happens. Yes, thank you. Let me pause this recording.